I got this real moron thing I do. It's called thinking.
Simon & Schuster Audio presents Last Words by George Carlin with Tony Hendra. Read by Patrick Carlin. Featuring a conversation with Kelly Carlin and Tony Hendra.
Tony, I was curious about how this book originally came to be.
Well, I should probably explain that I knew George from way, way back. And we first got to meet one another in 1964 when we were both sort of struggling comedians. And we both were sort of hanging out in the village and appearing at a place called, rather unfortunately named, the Café Au Go-Go, which was sort of one of these nexuses of young performers, singers, and comics and musicians. And we had several things in common, and after that sort of initial meeting, we sort of were friendly competitors throughout the rest of the 60s, and then kind of parted company in much the same kind of way when George rebelled very much against the orthodoxy and censorship of 60s comedy and underwent his sort of first major transformation. And I did something very similar, putting all this stuff behind me and becoming one of the original editors of the National Lampoon. And then we sort of lost touch with one another until the mid-'80s when I decided after doing 25 years of satire that I'd now probably write about it. And I put a book together which was this upgrowth of radical and irreverent humor that began in the mid-'50s and then matured in the '60s. And a little after that, I think he got the author bug himself and started working around, I would say sometime in the late '80s, on an autobiography, which around 92, he asked me to take a look at. And what it was 100 pages. He actually called it The 100 Pages. It had no other title, which dealt with the first 6 years of his life in very funny detail, but sort of interspersed with these rather self-conscious, author sort of passages. And I pointed out that the math here was going to mean that if he did wrote an account of the first 60 years of his life, the book would be 1,000 pages long, which even in an era of morbidly obese memoirs would probably be a bit much. And he said, yeah, he knew that. That's why I was reading the fucking thing. And that really sparked the whole process because he said he needed someone to help. And so began the always hilarious and very erratic process of documenting the life and times and oeuvre of Mr. George Carlin. So that's really how the book started. And over the next, from about 93 to 98, 99, we recorded many, many hours, 40 or 50 hours of conversations, and as many probably unrecorded conversations, which I simply took notes on. And that really was the kind of core of the book. And we also sort of couldn't decide what to call it, because George didn't want to call it an autobiography. He thought that was very pretentious. And he said only pin-headed business pricks and politicians wrote autobiographies. And we also decided that the term memoir, the pretentious Gallicism memoir, wasn't appropriate either because it was probably a linguistic mongrel of me and moi. So we didn't use either of those. And we sort of cast around for a year or so about what to call it. And I had begun, at his request, to include kind of biographical background because he wanted to place himself in the context of, the last 40 years or so of comedy. And I began to write these kind of historical things, placing him in exactly that context. So it became half autobiography and half biography. So we decided to call it a sort of biography. And that was what it was called forever afterwards. And then around 2004, 2005, he had a new idea, which was that he'd always wanted to sort of cap his career with a Broadway show, a one-man Broadway show along the lines of Lily Tomlin's wonderful The Search for Intelligent Life in the Universe. And he'd spoken to me about this also and said that, he might want my help on it. So when he finally got time to do this Broadway show, we would put the sort of biography out simultaneously, and the success of one would feed the success of the other. And alas, that never came to be, and so the book didn't come to be while he was alive.
I guess something I'm also curious about is what it's been like for you to finish this book with him not being here to finish it with you.
Well, on one level, it's sort of, it's a co-writer's dream because you get to make all your own editorial decisions, which is quite good. But the other thing, honestly, was that, I was terribly affected by George's death and by the loss of that wonderful voice, and I mean voice in all its aspects. So going back and listening to these often quite wonderful tapes, which were very free form, they were much less interviews than they were just conversations about everything to do with comedy and to do with his approach to it, was just very, very saddening, of course. And the way I summed it up to somebody recently was, I said I wasn't a ghostwriter on this book, I was the writer for a ghost. And his presence was very strong in all those cases. And I'd get so engrossed in sort of shaping these conversations that it would seem like I was doing them with him in the room. But I think all of that's, helped give it its authenticity, because what I really wanted to do more than anything was to capture that voice and fulfill what I think his purpose was in beginning this book in the first place, which was less to give an account of his life than to give an account of his art and how he got there, and how at every stage that evolved into something always opening further and further into genuine art and genuinely artistic craft. So the book is very much about his growth as an artist, although obviously, as you know well, there are episodes which are about the other aspects of his life. So to the degree that I've fulfilled that aim of his, I would have to say this has really been a labor of love more than anything.
And it's so interesting because one of the things I've been grappling with since he's been gone is how to represent him in the world that lives up to his almost impossible standards that he held himself up to in his art. And also getting that he's not here and having to hold that tension between those two things. And at the same time, really knowing, especially those of us who were close to him, how impeccable he was.
Yes, indeed. The other way I thought of it was, those magnificent pieces of music like Schubert's Unfinished Symphony that other people had to finish. And you can only guess at what would have been the result, if he'd been here to do it himself. But you do the best and you make the best music you can. But there were some surprises, weren't there, Kelly, in this book for you?
Yeah, it was fascinating. I reading it, of course, there was the narrative that I know about my father's life already and that I've grown up into. And then there were these little other areas where there were little surprises and moments that I got to learn stuff about my dad and stuff that probably I'm guessing we would have never talked about and would have never come out in our conversations. I mean, little things and big things, but I mean, one of which is like even how much influence his brother, my uncle Patrick, had on his life. Right. And reading that chapter and really getting it, like, wow, I didn't get that before, and then my father becomes this more whole, richer human being in my eyes. And also, there was a little part where he talks about, I think it was the late 70s and early 80s, after the big success and the big change and all of that. And he talks about going into a direction that could almost be considered conceptual art in his mind. And that he said if he didn't have the pressure, the middle class pressure of having a house and a family and all of that, he might have gone into conceptual art. And reading that, for me, I've always had that struggle too inside of me. And because of my father's success, I always felt like, well, I have to be seen and heard and big. And if 10,000 people aren't paying attention to me, it's nothing at all. And yet I've always felt this pull to be really obscure and strange and alone in my own conceptual art. And it suddenly gave me more freedom. Like, oh, I see where that comes from. There's this urge in me to just go and be strange in the corner and be okay with it. And he had that too. And so that was really exciting. I was actually just reading that a few days ago and it hit me again.
The other thing about Patrick I found totally fascinating, I must say, that he introduced Patrick into the process quite early on, and I was blown away about how similar these two had become by, say the mid-90s. And yes, the credit which George gives to Patrick for sort of not, on the one hand, kind of, I think he became a more popular comedian in a way. He got a more sort of popular voice, or populist, perhaps I should say, through really sort of returning to the friendship with his elder brother. And he made a big point of that several times. And certainly Patrick contributed to that development of his voice in his sort of greatest period, which began in sort of 91, 92. In his earlier performances, he had really sort of kind of a light tenor voice, a kind of hippie version of a light Irish tenor. But Patrick sort of deepened and broadened that voice into what eventually became George's signature sound. Yeah, those influences were hugely important.
So later in his life, he kind of recollects that part of himself that he kind of left behind, which is that very populist. It's a great word to use. There's a street. There's a street mentality there. There's the common man, and getting to reclaim that part of himself and his energy, and then weaving it so beautifully with the high intellectual wordplay aspect of himself. And yeah, what a force it became then with those two energies together.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it also made it very natural for Patrick to be the person who reads this book too. It was, my first thought was, that there would be an audio book, and Patrick seemed to be the obvious person to do it.
And it's like, of course it's going to be Patrick. I mean, not only is, in some ways, the quality of their voice similar in an eerie way, but my God, it's a very, very close DNA. So and I'm thrilled for Patrick too.
And how do you feel now that you've read some of these things that you didn't know? How do you feel about the things that affect you directly?
As a daughter of a very successful artist, he just wasn't there a lot. Physically. And then mentally, he wasn't there a lot because he was a man who lived a very internal life as an artist, and he was always working in some ways. And then when we did connect, it was 100%. I mean, he was one of those people that when he took the time and could put his work aside and be with you, it was all of him showed up, and it was magical and wonderful. So reading this end of the book here where he talks about the difficult choices he made and almost the narcissism and the obsession of being an artist, it really healed me in a way because I felt like he was directly saying, hey, kid, I get it.
Yeah. One of his favorite words was authentic. He always wanted to be authentic. He made choices in word choices. He made thought and logic choices. And I think that was what he wanted to always achieve, his authentic voice. The George in me comes out authentically, not as some kind of artistic distortion of who he was.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, his disdain for pretense of people and in our culture.
Oh, yeah.
It makes perfect sense,
yeah.
And it's fascinating because since he's been gone and talking to people who, fans especially, and emails and Facebook and Twitters from all over the world, the one thing people say to me is he was like a friend. He was just a guy on the stage. He wasn't an icon or some famous person. He was just a guy on stage speaking the truth, which made me feel like I wasn't so crazy in the world because I think that way too. And so he got to do what he set out to do then.
Sure.
That's very
Absolutely.
cool.
Absolutely. So few of us do or will.
Absolutely.
But I mean, it's a terribly overused word, but I mean, he really was the everyman, the voice of the everyman. And I think that's his crowning achievement, really. He spoke for all of us.